Hi, my name is Ethan Barnhart, founder of Vulcan Digital Solutions, and today I'm going to be discussing building a lead magnet to incubate cooling leads and a reheating tool essentially to re-engage with past disengaged leads for the company Highground Cyber. This final application serves something like a credit monitoring tool, if you want to call it that, just as an analogy, that would continuously monitor the risk of certain organizations and notify them when things changed in order to get their attention and close a deal. And I'm going to be discussing the production of this final application from front to back. I carried a number of different responsibilities in getting this thing to market, but most of the situation is going to be focused on the design process and the design thinking. There's going to be things in here regarding requirements gathering, business analysis, but also some of the technical details of it, because I carried it out of design and then into a subsequent set of engineering sprints. And you'll get to see this process from front to back and what the final application ended up looking like. If it gets too long or you're only interested in one or two of those aspects, you feel free to skip around in the video. There's no reason to watch the whole thing if you don't feel the need to. All right, let's jump into it. So in order to understand this project, first and foremost, we have to understand Vistage. Vistage is an international organization consisting entirely of executives forming up into chapters, and those chapters of executives pay dues to a chair who's another executive who's got 20, 30, 40 years of experience and is probably approaching retirement. And the entire purpose is that the chair can serve as a mentor and an educator to the younger executives, and the executives can all get together in a room and bounce ideas off of each other, collaboratively problem solve, bring in guest speakers on market events or key issues in order to brain vulture as much information as they can from the right people. And then with what they've accomplished there in that session, they break from their session and start implementing in their companies. And it's just a perpetual cycle of executive development and growth. Now, Ken, the founder of Highground Cyber, identified Vistage early on as a key aspect of the sales strategy for the company. So that we're going to have a top-to-top sales model that interfaces directly with the decision maker from day one, so we can strip out all of the ladder climbing in the decision-making process and the delays that come with that. And when you're talking about like multi-year commitments to something like a cybersecurity program and cyber as a concept that has strategic implications covering a lot of different disciplines, you want somebody like the executive to be the one signing on the dotted line, right? So here's the kicker for the Vistage ecosystem. Vistage executives as leads cool off really quickly, and there's a good reason for this. A lot of them are part of the SMB. It's the small and mid market, and their revenue and headcount could range anything from sub-million in ARR up to $500 million in annual revenue, and it's one person sitting next to the person in charge of 1,000 people. So there's going to be a lot of different problems on the table for these organizations that have varying levels of organizational complexity. And I mean, just think about the events of the last 5 years, let's say. There's a lot of pressing issues that hit these people and a lot of vying for their attention. So they have very little mind share for something that's abstract, that's existential, that's far off, that happens to other people and all the misconceptions. And if you don't know a lot about the topic of cybersecurity, there's a lot of reasons to put it off or to be scared of it, let's say. So with all of the urgency in front of them, there's no mind share left over for a topic like this. And they first see it in a way that's accessible to them when Ken comes to speak to them. They're super enthusiastic about it. They're very engaged. 4.7 out of 5 ratings as a speaker, which is very hard to do. They corner him and just like talk his ear off for an extra half hour when he's done giving a presentation. And then as soon as everyone leaves the room, they all change their SIM card, they move upstate, they change their name, they join the witness protection program, and you will never find them again. They are very hard to nail down. So how do you solve that problem? The first pivot that had to happen in the sales process is going to be going through Vistage chairs, because they are the accountability and the education mechanism in Vistage. They're the ones who are going to ensure that these people who are kind of shiny object by nature, moving from thing to thing because they have to be, are going to sit down and eat their broccoli or think through a complex problem like cybersecurity or the needs for it in their business and make sure that they're doing something about it after they've been given the knowledge, right? To not do anything and not know is ignorance. To not do something after being told very clearly what might happen and how to do something about it is negligence. There's a legal standard there that's kind of important that you want to be able to hold people to as a standard. But these Vistage chairs don't want to become an authority on the topic. Like I said, they are in their 60s, 70s. I pay somebody to deal with my technology. If it's anything more complicated than an answering machine, I'm ready to throw it out a window. Do not make me an authority on this topic, please. So there's another issue that we have to overcome. We made a prior attempt at overcoming this issue with a tool very similar to this, and it ultimately fell flat for UI UX reasons. Now, this is where I enter the equation, and I have to either rescue this solution or recycle the code that is perfectly fine, it's immaculate code, into something more effective elsewhere, targeted at a different audience. So this is how we move into the larger discussion. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to rescue that lead magnet. Now, after describing the demographic and the situation somewhat, maybe you have a clear enough idea in your head of who we're talking to, but we're going to follow design best practice here, and we're going to build our avatar, our user profile. Here you can see in front of us, we've got Vistage, Vic, and Vicky. These are our Vistage chairs who are successful corporate executives in their 55 to 75 age range. And the education is pretty fast and loose, but generally they might have an MBA, and they're going to be located in the US. And we chose the US specifically because dealing with compliance requirements from a cyber perspective outside the US is just too much of a headache for Highground to have to deal with. If you're talking about GDPR in the EU, for instance. Now, when it comes to the bio or the background of these executives, they're probably at a phase in life where they're retaining a board position, they're thinking about succession planning, or they're nearing retirement. And the companies that they've built started from the garage or the basement up to the big corner office with headcounts in excess of 200 employees to 2,000 employees and in excess of $250 million in annual revenue. And when you're talking to somebody like that, like I said, they're very smart. They think long-term, they don't accept shortcuts, and this idea of the riverboat gambler or the get-rich-quick scheme is not something that ever passes the smell test for them. They want things done the right way. They want to leave something better than they found it, and they want something that's sustainable, that uplifts the community. They didn't have that community mindset to begin with. They wouldn't engage with these people in Vistage the way they do. Their goals, they want to resolve issues and remove the obstacles for those next hot generations of entrepreneurs, so that their lifetime of experience actually stands to benefit somebody and that there's an increase in momentum. And they value being that key person, that nexus in somebody's network. They love networking with organizations and having a deep Rolodex to say, somebody raises their hand, I have this issue, does anyone know a person? They can reach in and say, I know a guy. Call that person, they'll take care of you. And they want to keep an active mind at this phase in life. They want to keep and build community with the people around them. They like being part of a group, and they want to solve problems and, tinker and give back ultimately. Now, they're also concerned with the change of technology and the way things are getting away from them potentially, which is relevant to this discussion. They want to preserve that social capital that they've accrued throughout their life. And they are just kind of thinking about time with the grandkids and friends that they haven't seen in a long time at this point. And they're probably pretty preoccupied with estate planning or legacy or succession planning, if that isn't something that they haven't nailed down already. So let's boil down some of the starting value we wanted this lead magnet to provide into our starting requirements here. Right? We wanted to report the risk levels of public internet infrastructure for each of the Vistage group members we encountered back to them in the areas of DNS, content security, SSL and TLS configurations, their email configurations, which has a big impact on things like deliverability and your reputation if you get caught in spam firewalls and things like that, and HTTP header configuration. Now, those are 5 areas that people may or may not understand, but they're good entry points. There are 5 areas that people can have explained to them relatively easily and at a general level be given a report card on. Next, we want to be able to report the differences in risk to the chairs between Vistage members who've engaged with Highground and actually done something about their cybersecurity posture and those who haven't, so that they can see things get cleaned up over time. We want to be able to report the aggregate risk of the group as a whole to the chair who oversees multiple groups, because the added wrinkle here that I didn't quite cover is that a chair can be in charge of one group, or they could be something like a master chair in charge of multiple groups. Think about like a bishop versus a cardinal versus a priest. It's the same exact concept in the hierarchy. And we want to provide a repository of executive briefs and work guides on the current cyber issues at hand, so that these chairs can basically refer Highground's content to the members as value without having to be that expert themselves. And we want to provide a point of contact or submission forms or opportunities to raise a hand for those Vistage chairs in the event that any of their members actually want to step up and engage on a cyber issue. The thing that we don't want, and the thing that we wanted to actively avoid in all of this is intended to be proactive. We're in the business of helping people before the problem hits. We are fitness coaches. We are not trauma surgeons here, right? The number of phone calls that we received from panicked executives already talking about a payroll event or talking about a ransomware event were getting too high to count. And that was part of the impetus for doing something like this to begin with, is giving people an opportunity to reach the low-hanging fruit and start the journey somewhere in a way that wouldn't be exorbitantly intimidating or expensive, and would also allow them to just be safer in the way that they do their business. And we want to be able to provide periodic updates to that reporting that's being done on a regular cadence so that people could see a differential, a before and after image on how things are going for that organization if they decide to engage. And then last but not least, from a UI UX perspective, because I called that out earlier, we need this to be responsive and mobile optimized. The idea being that a chair who's interested in checking up on their members can open this thing up on the golf course or wherever they are, because they're not in the office, that's for sure, and just peruse through and see what's going on and be able to quickly uptake that information in a way that's accessible to them from a device that isn't going to be a desktop. So given all those starting requirements I just listed off, we're going to make a brief departure into the technical aspect of this. So you can see where we're starting from, and I'm going to work from the top down, solution architecture to application architecture, and then it will get tied in with the other design work that comes later so you can see the final result of all of this. Now, you can see in the subdivision at the top of this solution architecture diagram, everything within the orange box is responsible for the testing. That is the testing engine that does all of the risk monitoring and reporting. From right to left, very briefly, we have a customer-facing website that functions just like any other website, where people are going to enter the URL they want tested, and it'll test as an ad hoc report or on a regular cadence. Behind that, you're going to have Azure Functions, which is just Microsoft speak for microservices, with a bunch of individual functions that handle the constituent elements in a complete test. And then the Azure Message Bus is handling the current state of those tests individually as they're being orchestrated, so they can be combined back up together into a final report with some summary information, generated as a PDF and dropped into the Azure Blob storage container for final storage. At the boundary of this, again, you're also going to have another endpoint serving as an API, dedicated API exclusively for use by Highground employees that requires Highground credentials to schedule those same reports and tests and run them on a regular cadence, because after all, this is going to be consumed by our Vistage chairs now in a separate context on a regular basis. We're talking about week to week or month to month reporting to see what the difference has been per one of our requirements. Now, to follow the flow of a traditional Vistage chair using this service, they're going to enter through the web application firewall for some basic geofencing and request inspection, and then they're going to have to sign in, and their sign in is going to be based off of their application defined user identity, which was based off of credentials we would have already had from them, things like their email address to sign in, and then we're going to need their phone number so that we can send them a one-time PIN with which they can 2FA into the application. That's all being done through Twilio, and once they go in through the front door with a valid set of credentials and they've performed their 2FA check, they have access to all the data inside the Vistage Chair portal that's fundamentally relying on a shared set of database information across these two solutions in the form of a database responsible for the test results, handling all of those different categories I mentioned before in the earlier set of requirements, as well as the association back to that particular member that they're looking into. And that member's information is going to have to come from our CRM system. Our CRM system of choice is the Microsoft Dynamics 365 instance that I migrated Highground to in an earlier project that you can see in another case study that I performed. And I, as the local developer here in this situation, I'm authenticating into Azure Active Directory before I can do any of this work. I make pushes to production directly from my machine with the publish inside of Visual Studio, and then I'm making git commits up to our Azure version control with Azure DevOps. And the reason these two databases, I want to call it in particular, are separate from each other, obviously, is because of the kinds of data we're dealing with. The kinds of leads that we're interacting with are inherently high value. So we don't want any incidental leakages or compromises. And in the event that one happens, you want a fire break between one and the other. Test results that are more or less anonymized or result in knowledge about a particular GUID rather than an individual are something entirely different than the names, locations, email addresses, and phone numbers of executives of multi-million-dollar corporations. So basic due diligence to be done there. With regards to the application architecture in place, this is remarkably simple compared to the view we just looked at. You've got a set of user views, and then you've got a singular admin view, which I as an individual or anyone else inside of Highground as an individual would use for orchestrating the cadence at which people were being tested per one of the requirements I mentioned before, so that people could be tested on a weekly, monthly cadence or tested once and then forgotten about. You've got services responsible for handling the logging of particular user activity so we could track how effective the lead magnet actually was, and then an account service to handle the back and forth between a CRM system and the records in question inside of the database, and a risk reporting repository that handled the access to files pertaining to those work guides and the executive briefs that I had mentioned as one of the requirements earlier. The objects here are stupid simple. It's just a linear tree going from a user to a group to a member to a risk result. And the only users that we have inside this system are chairs. So user can be assumed as synonymous with chair. Talking about tools and frameworks here is a little appetizer for the engineering side of this discussion that's going to come later. HTML5, CSS3, and JavaScript, the holy trinity of front-end development. You're going to see that no matter where you go. And then D3.js for data visualization. I had to port the existing solutions prior implementation of Chart.js over to D3.js, and I have to say I am much more impressed with D3. That thing is addicting. And then Figma for the design aspects of all of this that are going to come immediately after this. With regards to backend, it was built on .NET 6.0. It's an MVC application with Razor Pages, and that's going to be a recurring theme for a lot of my projects. And then Twilio SMS for messaging, using the pre-approved cell phone number that we had in place to deliver those OTP messages to people direct to their cell phone as a means of 2FA. And then for data, we've got Entity Framework as the out-of-the-box ORM that's traditional of a lot of .NET applications, and SQL Server Management Studio for handling queries and procedures with databases. Surprise of surprises here, this project timeline follows the typical two-act structure between design and engineering, where I'm walking it all the way through. It starts with architecture and application review, producing a lot of the same deliverables like I just put in front of you, and that started on August 19th, and you'll notice that the project ends on September 16th, so that's roughly a month. It's a relatively compressed timeline for a project like this. We've got 2 design sprints, the first one focusing on lo-fi prototyping, second one moving into hi-fi until we're completed with the design component. And then after that, I'm carrying it into engineering, where I'm building the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to just get it up to par with what was built in Figma. And the second engineering sprint has to do with porting over from Chart.js to D3, like I mentioned earlier, implementing slicers so that these Vistage chairs could interact with the data a little bit more clearly, and then switching approaches from an eager loading approach where there's a typical call and response between client and server in one complete request to a lazy loading approach where you bring everything in and then using JavaScript, you fetch the data and then populate the D3 charts after the page is loaded, just to increase the usability and decrease the load times before your first contentful paint. All right, so with all that table setting out of the way, let's get designing. I'm going to talk about where we're at and where we're going, and Design Sprint 1 is going to be about user pains and empathy. We've heard past feedback, like, can you please explain this report to me? Or what should I even be looking for? And those comments on their own are not super encouraging, but they tell me that there's 2 primary issues we're going to have to go and solve. It's going to be readability and it's going to be navigability. Here you can see an example of the home page from the prior iteration. First thing that jumps out to me right away here is, why is this image being cut off? And you can see it's because there's a header element here that's blocking the underlying scroll content for the rest of the page. And that header and the body of the HTML document are being defined with fixed pixel counts in block display mode. Now, whether or not that means anything to you, the net effect is that regardless of device, mobile, tablet, desktop, they're all going to be impacted by this choice of layout here. And I've represented that with a visualization where each of those colored boxes represent the header, the body, and the footer on the HTML document. And they're ordered by z-index, or the elevation, the layers as they slide past each other on the final website. If you look at the scroll content here on this homepage, there's a couple of different things to break down here. First thing I'll call out, am I expected to navigate this page by clicking each of these learn more links? What am I supposed to do? Where am I supposed to go? Second thing I'll call out is every page going to be like this? Dear God, it wasn't a nightmare. It's the first day of school and I really am in the wrong classroom. I don't know where to go. The usage of spacing from a Gestalt principle perspective, I would want headers to be closer to block copy or closer to images depending on what they represent, and the usage of line breaks as well. It's hard to tell where one section begins and another ends. And the problem here, a third one, gets aggravated even further when you realize that this is going to be truncated by a third of the usable view height. We're going to have even less usable vertical height in the browser than we're given currently to look at all of the content at once. And that's going to create an affordance issue. If I don't know where something begins and ends, I expect as a user to start and finish something every time I scroll. I want to accomplish something by scrolling. And I don't really get the sense of that here. And as far as home pages go, this conflates a little bit of the design principles you would see from something like a landing page, for instance, where it's allowed to go on and on and on like it does here, as a feature, not a bug. And what we're seeing here, which is just kind of a violation of what a homepage is supposed to be. Your homepage is your temple. If you've ever used Google, if you've used YouTube or anything dashboard adjacent, it's supposed to be the simplest thing to understand, the cleanest, fewest assumptions, so that people can jump off of it and navigate into more complex areas of the website, but they're not scared of what's coming next right away. This creates a very difficult expectation for other people as they're moving into the website. Is the rest of the experience going to be like this? That's the biggest concern. So we were just looking at the scroll content as an isolate against a white background, but when you start to look at it in its original context as well, you can see why there were some readability concerns that we had heard earlier, right? And so with this images, and for instance, you can see that the rightmost third of the text on the screen here starts to look busy in places or difficult to read, and it's kind of hard to describe why, but I have some numbers to actually back it up and show you why. So if I took a sample of the word between in that paragraph and I compared the light and dark values of the mountain background against each other, you get a 2.11 contrast ratio. On its own, doesn't really matter. But when you take the darkest value of the mountain background and compare it to the value of the text that's on the screen, you get 2.18. Why does that matter? They're nearly identical. So in this sample of 3 particular points, the highest and lowest values from a color theory perspective of the mountain background are just as far apart from each other as they are from the text. So our chimpanzee brains are literally losing the forest for the trees in places, and you don't want that. Ideally, contrast ratios are something in the 4 range or above. If you can't achieve that, then what I would hope for is that this mountain background at least has something like half of the contrast ratio of either of those values against the value of the text itself. So we need to make some improvements in places. When we move on from just the home page into the Vistage group reporting pages that carry the water for this application, you can see some other problems. This is the group reporting page. It shows the metrics we were concerned about for an entire group. And right away, you can see some problems. This report view is chopped due to the same problem we were having earlier with headers, bodies, and footers, and the way that's being laid out. Now, this is not an ideal aspect ratio, but even at a traditional 16:9 aspect ratio in a desktop or any of the others that you could conceive of with a tablet or an iPhone, let's say, this problem still exists. And you need to be able to read the charts in their entirety. But speaking of reading the charts, you can see that the labels are incredibly small, and we're talking about an ideal user base with bifocals, and they're not tech natives. So these colors in something like a radar diagram, which has the potential to be tremendously informative, stack up rather quickly and then bury vital context clues in the chart and its labeling underneath them that kind of remove any hope or prayer of understanding this at first glance and make the task of digging in on the data more difficult than it needs to be, and encourages people to bounce. So having done the design critique here and having my preliminary requirements laid out, it was time to go back and update those requirements to include some UI UX standards, to say things like text must remain readable, and that we needed sufficient size on the labeling of charts so that people could read them. And given all of that, I have an updated set of requirements here. I'm not going to read them, but you can pause the video and go through them if you like. So we've gone through the stack and what the application is capable of currently. We've done a design critique to see what the application looks like currently and what isn't working. So with that, I jumped straight into a lo-fi prototyping exercise in this first sprint in Figma. I opted not for paper wireframes. I don't have a problem with paper wireframes. I enjoy them, but didn't feel it was necessary when the scope of what is and isn't happening in this case is a little bit more reduced, and you don't need to be as out there with ideation. The departure that I made right away that's still kind of in the spirit of ideation is a dashboard. I don't want to scroll endlessly through something on the homepage and confuse the user. I want clean tiles. I want some of those tiles to reduce the information density of the total view. And then instead of reading a bunch of information to try and get my bearings, have it explained to me. I want to watch somebody tell a story, have it explained to me in a way that I don't really have to exert that much effort over. And we preserved a lot of the same views from the prior dashboard or reporting set that you might have seen earlier, but with, again, some ideation that didn't end up making the cut. I thought it would be cool if members and their interactions with Highground could be documented in kind of a timeline using some of the CRM data that we might have over in Dynamics. Didn't end up implementing it. And similarly, we didn't implement the engaged versus disengaged risk metrics over time because of the complexity involved in that and the timeline that we were on. But we did expand on the idea that you're seeing in the upper right of a stoplight view of the different risk categories involved by the members or by the groups that a chair might be responsible for. We got resources. I need to be able to see the executive briefs and the work guides that you're offering and maybe some explainers on key topics in a clean, concise view where it's pretty much all present with very little interaction on my part. I want to get all of it at a glance, and then I want to pick at it in detail where I'm interested. So you can kind of see the inspirations from something like a DoorDash, for instance. If this is going to be a sliding carousel that people can drag their finger across and explore in further detail. A help page where it's just plain and simple. You're able to drop a card, submit a form, type out your message or your request, and send it over to Highground where it's going to get collected, probably in an Azure storage account somewhere. It's just a form submission. And then links off to our other services on the Highground webpage. If you need something in particular, you want to call Ken back for another speaking engagement, or you need intensives on a particular topic, etc., run the gamut. This was another experimental view that we didn't end up implementing, but I did flesh out to some degree the idea that we could get community engagement from the chairs because they, are business leaders. They are competitive by nature. If they could see how they stand relative to others, they could either help lift up other members who are lagging with their member scores or make a competition out of it. We can just gamify the whole experience of getting cyber secure. Concurrent with lo-fi prototyping is a more fundamental question of colorways and structure for Highground specifically. You can stick with the existing colorways and branding that you have in place all throughout other areas of your IP, or you can make a slight variation on a theme here to better cater to your audience to indicate a visually distinct solution that is part of the larger stack of solutions you offer, but a very specific audience, and create all of the connotations that you're aiming to create for the audience in a way that might also increase usability, while also sticking true to the spirit of what Highground is. And the point I made earlier about being fitness coaches and not trauma surgeons actually ended up becoming the final 10-word answer. It was the casus belli, the war cry, the reason we're doing what we're doing. And that key distinction meant no guys in blacked out hoodies, no matrix waterfalls of code, no any of this dark, red, evil cyber branding that you might see that pretty commonly throughout the industry. It's about health, it's about wellness, it's about self-improvement, it's about the wash stone that you might see on the exterior of a Lifetime Fitness, it's about the greenery and the flowing water, the neutral palette tones that you'd see in packaging on something like AG1. And we're going to design this with the intent of having some proximity to those physical spaces and the emotions and the connotations that they have with that for the reasons why they're doing what they're doing and the devices that they carry around with them all the time. Now, these people might not be tech natives and they're older, but the cross-generational adoption of something like a smartphone means that they're going to be seeing rounded edges and frosted glass and bento boxes on a daily basis and know how to drive that kind of device or that kind of user interface. So we can rely on that for some verisimilitude to these existing devices and these existing spaces that these people probably spend some amount of time in and have a set of connotations to. It's the end of design sprint 1. I've got my lo-fi prototype and now I've got my paintbrush. So it's time to start doing hi-fi prototypes. And here we've got our dashboard. You can see we've added help elements, and each of those will toggle a little sliding motion graphic pane with a sentence or less explaining what's going on in the tile if you need it. And we've expanded on the idea of this stoplight risk reporting approach where a chair could see all of their groups simultaneously and all of their members simultaneously. And this is where the potential power of something like slicing the data started to enter the conversation. If I can filter it down to only focus on, pay attention to the thing I care about in this moment, I could probably glean a lot more data and be able to pivot around really quickly inside of a single view without ever leaving it. We've got resources, which is almost completely unaltered from the lo-fi prototype because all of the use cases for this are essentially accounted for already. And we just needed to ensure that it's still reminiscent of all of the same mountain imagery and iconography that's true of the Highground brand and sticking to our colorways and our structure. Same is true for the help page with some imagery around the added services that Highground offers in different forms on different websites. And then the community page. And this is one of those things where you would really love to go and chase it down. You'd really love to go do it. There's that joke about Q5. We'll get it done in Q5 when we figure out how to fit another quarter in the year. And so while it was roadmapped, it didn't end up coming to fruition, but it was a lot of fun to work on. So the hi-fi prototyping exercise felt relatively plug and chug for this circumstance. There's not much else to really describe there. So it quickly goes over to the engineering phase. And for my developers out there who understand the difference between the level of effort required to build something in Figma and the level of effort to make it a reality on a web page, I feel your pain, and I have the rare and masochistic opportunity to inflict that pain on myself a lot of the time. So the entire first engineering sprint is making the web pages one for one with what's in the Figma designs that I created. And then, just accommodating for corner cases in different browser sizes and making it fully responsive and just making it look good. Then the second engineering sprint is about these 3 cases that I called out earlier, these 3 problems where I have to migrate the reports out of Chart.js to D3 because I feel they're way more capable. And in terms of visuals, they could actually match the design cues that I had laid out for myself in the Figma design earlier. And more importantly, it's about building those charts to the design now in Figma rather than what we were trying to accomplish in the prior iteration of the solution. Next is unblocking page loads with this post-load data fetching pattern that D3 supports and that we could start using to optimize the page loads for the user so it doesn't feel overly sluggish when pulling data. Then implementing slicers and tooltips on the chart so we can just juice out any last bit of usability and satisfaction from the user for interacting with the data and asking questions. And the way that was accomplished in JavaScript was more or less just kind of an air traffic control pattern where you're doing global state management at the page level for the different collections of data on the tiles and how they might relate to one another so that when you pull the thread in one, you click to enable or disable one, you're adding or removing elements from the collections in those other tiles where they're associated so that things are constantly being updated and you're seeing the picture of the data as it stands for the thing you're interacting with. Parallel to my development efforts, the Highground team in the background is producing content to feed into the final application, things like 2-minute explainer videos on the topics, each of the 5 in the final report, or that intro tutorial so that people can be guided through how to use the platform in a way that isn't overly burdensome, or executive briefs and workbooks for that help and resources area of the website so that chairs can continue to provide that value to Vistage members without having to become experts in the topic. So we go Power Rangers, Megazord together with our separate disciplines into a final application here. And you can start to see the solution in play. We've got a home page here with those D3 visualizations up and running, and the ability to slice across groups and individual members to filter that data. We've got those rollout help text windows so you can get more context if it doesn't make sense at a glance. And you can start to see late in the game, we made a design decision to swap out that bottom row for some risk assessment views on the likelihood of a business email compromise event, a ransomware event, or an ACH fraud event in any one of the worst performing members. Any one of those members out of a group of N size suffering one of these outcomes over the span of the next 12 months as just a loose percentage based off of market data, what we've seen in the past, and what we know about their environments, and how each of these 5 areas that we cover in our report contribute to those threat vectors. You can see we've got hovers, we've got tooltips so that people can further dig into the members of any particular collection, who has requested or not requested their report, who's engaged with Highground, who hasn't. You can answer those just kind of by sticking around and hovering over stuff or continuing to slice around. And then if you ever have a question about any of the 5 risk categories over in that stoplight view, this would be something that shows up. It's your 2-minute in-window explainer of the concept that you can get in and out of relatively quickly. So you never really have to leave the dashboard in any of this. And then again, with the emphasis on mobile first or mobile friendly, a Vistage share who's viewing this from a situation other than the office, which is incredibly likely, there's one-for-one parity in the performance of the charts. There's differences in layout, but equally navigable and equally intelligible in terms of just button presses, slicing around, and clicking into objects on that pie chart, for instance, to see who's in that group, and being able to quickly carousel around and scroll up and down to gather the executive briefs you want to hand off to somebody, or enter a message and send it off to Highground. All right, let's land the plane. Final benefits, what did we get? First and foremost is usability. Absolutely. There's motion graphics here that weren't there beforehand to reward user interaction. There's immediate page loading that's way snappier, no more waiting on data. There's tooltips that enumerate what's inside of each category so you don't have to work as hard for that information if you're answering a specific question. And there's hover highlights that change with the slicing of data as you slice it. All of this piles together rather quickly to remove any barriers to entry in reading these charts and allows you to gather way more context at a glance. And people hardly need to navigate off of the dashboard unless they're going for those executive briefs and those work guides, which is equally valuable in this lead magnet. As a result of all this, we saw increased follow-up, and the lead magnet was ultimately effective. The Vistage chairs who were already in the system when we announced that this new version was rolled out, we saw a doubling in the login activity from those chairs and new ones that were being added. And then the total downloads on those resources that they were intending to pass on to members increased by 30% in that same opening period. And in the first 60 days of this new product's rollout, Highground took 14 sales meetings from those aforementioned prior executives who were in the witness protection program. The rate at which they would normally cool off and then disappear is measured in a matter of hours. And here we are in the span of those first 60 days, taking 14 sales meetings, nearly 2 or 3 a week, sometimes 2 or 3 a day, and getting follow-on work as a result of that. The other thing that's harder to measure here, but is definitely a factor, is the earned marketing amongst chairs. It's the respect value. It's that old adage of let them see you sweat, building something that provides that level of value as a ready-to-use free resource for these people who value being connected and having a solution to problems. Did a lot in the eye of the Vistage community for those members who were plugged in on this issue to make Highground top of mind on this issue and easily recommendable as a solution to their members and other potential chairs in the larger community. All right, that's all I got. Thanks for sticking through it. My name is Ethan Barnhart, founder of Vulcan Digital Solutions. And if you like what you saw, if you got something you want built, if you want to see similar benefits in your organization, you can contact me with the contact information below on that slide. And with that said, stay safe. Have a good one.